This is CNN Money Switzerland with your continued coverage of the coronavirus spread in Europe. I'm Ana Maria Montero. In this episode, why 10 billion francs in emergency aid just isn't enough. This is Professor Sturm at one of the world's leading universities, and he is calling for a fund to the tune of 100 billion. More in just a moment. And 25 million people could be unemployed as a direct result of COVID-19. The International Labour Organization explains how your job could be at risk. And we meet the tech startup changing their business strategy to engage with the community in the developing crisis. All right, so let's dig into the one thing this Wednesday. Why the Swiss government just didn't go far enough with 10 billion in emergency aid. Jan Egbert Sturm is one of the two professors at the ETH University in Zurich, demanding that a special Swiss fund with 100 billion Swiss francs to complement the economic aid already put forward by the government. Mr. Sturm joins us now. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. So you think that 10 billion just isn't enough?
It's a good start. The 10 billion is largely intended to actually support short-time work. 8 billion out of the 10 billion is reserved for that. But this is not covering all the costs which are necessary. If you are a firm, then actually it's not only the personnel costs, which you still have to cover in the upcoming period, but also other costs.
But Germany, for example, is putting together 500 billion, France only 45. So 10 billion would make sense at a scale that we have here in Switzerland.
Well, if you actually look at the forecast which we have released yesterday at the KWF Swiss Economic Institute, then you actually see that we've calculated that in a relatively optimistic scenario, we would already be losing a GDP value of in total 17 billion Swiss franc in the upcoming 2 years.
All right, so is it a liquidity crisis that you want to prevent? And if so, why is that important?
Well, what we actually want to prevent is that these firms cease to exist. We are now in a situation in which firms have to downsize temporarily. We are in a world in which they can't produce as much as usual. But we also hope that after the crisis is over, after the pandemic has been dealt with, that these firms can restart the business again. So they need to survive during the current period, and they need liquidity for that. So,
in effect, it's like a bailout fund.
It's a reserve fund, it's a bailout fund. It's trying to capture all the needs for those firms who are currently clearly suffering in the situation we're currently having. All
right, so tell me, where are these 100 billion going to come from? I mean, is it the SNB going to put in some of that funding, private sector?
Well, this is, first of all, the government itself. The Swiss situation is such that we have a debt-to-GDP ratio which is far lower than in many other countries in the world, especially in Europe. And we're talking here with 100 billion about almost close to 15% of GDP. So if you put that into that perspective, it's actually still quite limited. And in that sense, I think it's well feasible for the Swiss fiscal system to cope with these kinds of sums.
All right, so the involvement of the private sector then, what kind of role would they play?
Well, of course, they can do all the things which they can do. Like, for instance, if you're a bank and you see that some firms are in trouble, then not immediately ask for the cash or the amount of money which is normally being supplied by these firms. So there are all kinds of ways in which also we in our daily life, in particular the firms amongst each other, can try to bridge the current period. Yes, we're really talking about bridging a period which is unique in history. We haven't seen that before.
And how urgent is it? How quickly do we need to act?
Well, the sooner we have this in place, the better it is, because it creates also certainty for these firms. They know that they do not have to completely shut down. They do not have to close the firm indefinitely, but they can basically go to a very low mode, keep the essential parts alive, and know that it will be covered for the time being by the public sector. And once the time comes, they can easily get going again, get the engine starting, so to speak.
And how are you going to select how are you going to distribute this money? I mean, how do you select the businesses that are entitled to it?
Well, that's indeed the most difficult part. Ideally, what we would like to know is how much a firm normally would contribute to total value added, total GDP in an economy. So what are the personnel costs? What are other fixed costs which they have to cover? And we need to provide the liquidity which allows them to at least sustain those things. We do not obviously need to cover the inputs into these firms, but probably they don't need those anymore. So the goods and services which they normally buy from other firms, they won't be buying to the same extent.
Is it fair to say that economists, though, don't often believe that the public sector is the best one to be distributing these kinds of funds?
Well, indeed, but these are unique situations. I would say, really, we need the government sector to stand behind the economy. It's basically an insurance scheme from certain dimensions. We need the firms to be assured that they can survive, they can bridge the current months to come, and after that actually get back to normal business, and then most likely also pay back these means. It's not our intention to actually give the money for free. The intention is that it's like a credit with probably something like a zero interest rate, which they can then subsequently over the years slowly pay back.
Humor me for a Humor me for a moment. Wouldn't it be perhaps easier to just, let's say, cut taxes or eliminate taxes for the rest of the year?
This is one mechanism, but we of course have to target those firms who are suffering. There are other firms which do not necessarily suffer a lot. So that's the big difficulty in the current crisis. We want firms to be able to downsize temporarily, but then also restart when needed. And not all firms have to downsize to the same extent. Some firms might actually see an increased demand currently. If we think about the health sector, then anything related to that will probably face a clearly increased demand in the time to come.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Sturm, and for your insights.
You're welcome.
Well, let's bring you up to date now with the latest in the coronavirus outbreak. Following the 10 billion Swiss franc emergency fund announcement this week, the Federal Council today discussed additional measures to cushion the economic consequences of the coronavirus epidemic. A decision is expected on Friday. Now, that comes amid reports that the country's biggest banks are working on a plan to support cash-strapped businesses. Credit Suisse said it is actively involved with the federal government, the Swiss National Bank, and the financial supervisor, FINMA, on ways to provide liquidity and loans for companies. UBS declined to comment. Meanwhile, the number of people with coronavirus has surpassed 200,000 worldwide. The number has doubled in the last 2 weeks. Now, the economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic could increase global unemployment by 25 million people. Now, that's according to the International Labour Organization. It's calling for an internationally coordinated response to the crisis facing the labor market. I spoke to them earlier to ask them how they came up with that number.
We are looking at the different economic forecast in the context of the COVID-19 the breakout, and we actually pick up the different economic growth scenarios from the rather modest economic growth, and also the having a bit of negative economic growth. And then third scenario is about the negative economic growth in a rather large magnitude. In the beginning, we thought the first scenario with the modest economic growth would be the realistic one. But as time goes by, we start to believe that probably the third scenario with quite a large fall in the GDP growth would be the more realistic. So from that perspective, we actually calculate what would be overall employment impact in that the negative economic growth scenario. Then we found it's going to be around the 25 millions. Just to give the sense of what kind of magnitude we are talking about here, is that the previous financial crisis in 2007 and 8, we estimated overall job losses was around 22 million.
I want to talk about how we can avert this or possibly mitigate this from happening. But before, tell me, what kind of jobs are we talking about? I mean, what are the sectors that are going to be most affected?
Of course, the tourism sector, as we can see from the Asian countries, that's the first to be hit. And also the other service sectors. We see quite a huge drop in the many the personal service as well. And this is going to be happen again, but I don't think this is the time to look at what sectors are hit most, because it will affect all the sectors at the moment. And when it comes to workers, we clearly see big actual risk for the non-standard workers or the gig workers, gig economy workers, and also unprotected workers. And also we are very much worried about the self-employed and also the small business as well. So at the moment, this will eventually translate into some difficult situation for especially young people and older people, and also for the women as well.
In further closures, the U.S. has decided to close the border with Canada to non-essential traffic. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, schools in Scotland and Wales will be closed from Friday. Indeed, Britain is facing serious stockpiling issues, with many shoppers becoming irate at a lack of access to healthcare provisions like painkillers and soap. CNN's Nina Dos Santos is behind the scenes at Britain's largest pharmacy.
The sign has become familiar around the world, and so have the empty shelves. As the UK steps up its effort to fight COVID-19, the country's largest pharmacy chain, Boots, finds itself on the front lines of supplying a panicked public trying to hoard supplies. And this is what they're after. We had to travel 3 hours north of London to find it, deep in Boots headquarters. With the government continuing to urge people to wash their hands, demand for products like these has soared. Boots says that hand soap sales have increased by nearly 1,000%. Other items like this paracetamol and vitamins are also selling fast, which means Boots has to turn these truckloads around quickly as soon as they reach the warehouse. The supplies aren't the problem, Boots says. It's getting them to where they're needed that presents the challenge. That means calling up seasonal workers and hiring more delivery drivers. Still, at this shop, just a few miles away, the aisles of painkillers are empty. Thermometers gone, and hand sanitizer, don't ask.
Undoubtedly, what we're seeing at the moment is unprecedented. I've never seen it in my career, and many of my colleagues have never seen it.
Clearly, people are very anxious.
Tracy Clements is Boots' top operations executive. As such, it's her job to keep the firm's 2,500 stores stocked. Why is hand sanitizer something that even on shelves of Boots is missing?
I think as we were saying, the increases in volume of sales are like nothing we've ever seen before.
Like other retailers, Boots now limits how much any customer can buy. But as soon as the shelves are replenished, they're cleared, leaving shoppers disappointed and Boots staff facing their frustration.
So customers may find that we have it for a part of the day, but not the whole of the day. But we continue to try to procure as much as possible.
To increase provisions, the company is bringing on new brands and is in talks with fresh suppliers.
We're learning every hour, and that's what we need to do actually. We need to accept that in this type of situation you can't be perfect. You have to make decisions that you believe are right.
Boots has more than 170 years of history on its side, supplying Britons through 2 world wars and the Spanish flu. But for all retailers and pharmacies, coronavirus is a learning curve, and for customers too. Nina Dos Santos, CNN, Nottingham, England.
This week, the WHO urged European countries to scale up their efforts in tackling the pandemic, highlighting China as an example of where drastic efforts to push back against the virus has shown evidence of working. In a press conference held via Facebook yesterday, the WHO's regional director for Europe, Hans Kluge, said there must be, quote, no exceptions when taking bold action. Well, here talking about the response from China and the other Asian countries and what we can learn from them there is CNN's Steve Young in Beijing.
Much has been said about China's Herculean and sometimes brutal efforts to contain the coronavirus, including locking down some 60 million people in their homes for weeks, knocking on every door in the city of Wuhan, where 9 million residents remained, to round up all suspected cases, sending them to makeshift field hospitals for mass testing and, if needed, treatment. And for the rest of the nation, the Chinese authorities had banned almost all travel and economic and social activities while tracking people people's health conditions and travel history with high tech and big data. So a lot of these draconian measures cannot be easily replicated in the rest of the world because other governments simply do not have this kind of top-down power structure, or they will have a lot of human rights concerns. That's why it's really worth taking a look at 3 other places in Asia where they have achieved remarkable success in containing this virus without resorting to the kind of over-the-top measures adopted by the Beijing government. We're talking about Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. They're all very densely populated places with very close economic and cultural ties to China. Now, they all share some common practices, including early adoption of travel restrictions targeting travelers from China, especially from Wuhan, and also strict quarantine rules targeting specific groups, as well as very effective communication campaigns about hygiene and social distancing. Now, but they also have distinctive features in each of these locations. In Singapore, they're very big on contact tracing, very thorough in finding close contacts of all confirmed cases to really stop the transmission of the virus. And in Taiwan, they're very strict in enforcing their home quarantine rules. Anyone caught from breaking or violating these rules would face a very stiff penalty. And in Hong Kong, they have been very big on social distancing from early date onwards, including sending government workers to work from home and encouraging other businesses to follow suit from late January onwards. So all these features really have worked because they address the problem identified by the World Health Organization, which is you have to have early identification, early isolation, as well as early treatment. That's why the WHO said you don't have to resort to the kind of mass lockdown as you have seen in China, as long as you stick to these mantra. But whether or not these 3 Asian places practices can be adopted by the US remains to be seen because they're relatively small in geographical location. The biggest of the 3, Taiwan, is only the size of the state of Maryland. And when it comes to early identification and early isolation, also maybe it's already too late for the US. That boat may have already sailed. Stephen Jiang, CNN, Beijing.
A Swiss tech startup is changing its business model to help communities during the coronavirus lockdown. Lucabox usually focuses on deliveries for businesses, but today it's opening its last-mile courier app to the broader public so that high-risk and vulnerable people can get food and medicine delivered to their doorstep. CNN Money Switzerland's Hannah Wise asked their CEO why they decided to make this change.
The idea actually came about during the weekend when we watched the press conference of the Austrian Chancellor about introducing the complete lockdown in Austria, and also when you look at Italy, where they need certain certifications to even leave the house, it became very apparent that we have a tool in-house that delivers things from A to B, only for businesses right now. But I think right now what is really needed is end consumers and each individual in the population. That was actually the original idea, to just support, to get to groceries, to get to medication in an easy and convenient way.
But this is also a business opportunity.
Yes, it is a business opportunity, but we're doing it we're only doing it covering our costs.
And what kind of costs are we talking about if you wanted, say, some medicine picked up from a pharmacy and delivered for you?
If you know exactly which medicine you need to have picked up, it's probably going to be around 20 to 25 francs. If you want to have a full shopping spree, it's a little more because the couriers are paid by the minute then. So then around 30 to 35.
So what kind of users are you expecting to take advantage of this?
We're expecting elderly people, or maybe mothers who don't want to leave the house, people who are maybe already sick, to use the tool to actually have somebody run their errands for them.
So what about the safety side of things? Because although this helps people keep their social distancing, what about the couriers who are actually doing the pickups and delivery? How are you protecting them?
Yeah, the couriers are actually doing an amazing job, and they've come up with measures very, very quickly with the announcements of the lockdown and the spread of the virus in general. They're disinfecting their hands regularly. They're picking up the goods at certain places. They're not delivering to the recipient's hands anymore. There's contactless payments. There's no signature anymore. So they're protecting themselves in the social distancing manner in every step of the way.
And how do they feel about this? Because they are putting themselves at risk by being out and about and having a little more contact than the average person is during a lockdown.
Well, bike couriers, by definitions, are a very proud group, I would say. They're very happy to now be able to help and to be the heroes of the situation. So it's great to work with them. They are very courageous. You have to say, and I think, and we're also hoping, and if we're looking to Austria and also Italy, the courier services stay active and stay open to support the population in this situation now.
So, of course, by law, everyone can still work, and you've had to adapt your business to do this. How have you done that?
We've spent almost every waking hours and some very late night hours since Sunday to actually reprogram our tool, the order tool that's called Scotty, to be more intuitive and user-friendly for end consumers to be used. And I think the team has done a really good job, and we're ready to launch today.
And do you think that this is something that might continue beyond the coronavirus lockdown?
I think only time will tell how end consumers react to the tool, how they use it, if they find it very easy to use and use it regularly. If there is a demand, there's no reason not to continue to keep it open.
Eike Festini, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Hannah.
And now a reminder of the main news today. 2 top professors at ETH in Zurich are calling for a 100 billion Swiss fund to help ease the economic burden of coronavirus. Meanwhile, the Federal Council today discussed additional measures to cushion the economic consequences of the pandemic. A decision is expected Friday. The International Labour Organization warns that the economic crisis triggered by COVID-19 pandemic could increase unemployment by 25 million people globally. And finally, coronavirus cases around the world topped the 200,000 mark for the first time this Wednesday. And that's you all up to date. You can get involved in today's news by checking out our social media pages on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And whatever the comment, as you know, it's always great to hear from you. Don't forget that you can always find everything, including what you've just seen, on our website, cnnmoney.ch. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow.